So I just interviewed Dr. Roy Speiser. You are not going to want to miss this. We used to think that all water's safe. If it's tap water, if it's drinking water, it's not going to have any effect on you long term. And we now know that's not true. It may have been true decades ago. It's not true today. I see it in my patients with high levels of toxins. And one of the sources is the water. And the good news is, if you watch this episode, you will come up with specific things that you can do to prevent exposure to toxins in your water by finding out how to purify your water. This has been Dr. Josh with Alzheimer's Breakthrough. Thank you so much for joining me today. Peace and plants. Today's guest has spent more than 3 decades uncovering the hidden contaminants in our environment, and he's here to reveal what's really lurking in plain sight. This is a conversation about water, toxins, and brain longevity with one of the top experts in the field. Dr. Roy M. Speiser is a scientist, researcher, and health advocate whose career spans biology, biochemistry, bacteriology, and biomechanical engineering. He holds both master's and doctorate degrees in biochemistry, and he is a level 5 water quality specialist certified by the Water Quality Association, one of the highest distinction in his fields. Dr. Speiser is a co-founder and vice president of Clear Water Revival, Inc., where he has developed advanced water purification systems for more than 35 years. As director of research at CWR Environmental Products, he constantly monitors the latest science to identify emerging unregulated contaminants from heavy metals and pesticides to pathogens and microplastics and forever chemicals that pose potential health risks. He is a sought-after lecturer and writer, bringing attention to the hidden health hazards in our everyday air and water. His mission is to empower people with knowledge and practical solutions to protect long-term health and cognition. What if the water you drink every single day could be silently shaping your brain health, even your risk for Alzheimer's? It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Roy Speiser. And Dr. Roy, thank you so much for being willing to be interviewed today.
Well, it's my pleasure, Dr. Helman. I find your work is outstanding, and it's really is a critical need for what you're doing.
You know, what's amazing is that I think the reason we gel is that we both have this strong background in biochemistry. I've got 2 degrees. You have your PhD in biochemistry. You've also studied microbiology. We're both scientists. And we're going to try today not to go over the head of anyone, but I think it's really important because many of the listeners here have Alzheimer's or a loved one with Alzheimer's or other neurologic conditions. And unfortunately, our water quality in this country is not up to par. And in many cases, I find it's one of the root causes for their problems. Has that been your experience too?
Absolutely, yes. Environmental factors, and I've been studying this since the 1980s. So years ago, when I'm dating myself a little bit, when I went through biochemistry, I also worked in the pharmaceutical industry. I became a healthcare practitioner. I'm not going to go into my whole history, but I started becoming aware of environmental factors. You know, everybody, when they didn't know what the causes, what you say was genetics. You know, it's like a grab bag for, answer. But over the years, all these studies that have come in now, environmental factors, air pollution, water pollution, food contamination, all come to the forefront of contributory factors to many different illnesses, including dementia and Alzheimer's. And water, there's certain toxic substances, heavy metals, we'll get into it in a minute, but yes, water is a crucial and very important source of life or your physiological functions. However, it's toxic, and I'll discuss that in a minute when we're ready.
So, certainly. And one of the things that's really concerned me is when I check toxins in my patients, I'm seeing higher and higher levels of lots of different toxins. Is that what you've been seeing? Not from people, but in looking at people's water?
Well, first of all, my clients are referred to me from various sources, from clinics in the United States. I've been working in the holistic field, like I said, for about almost 50 years. So there's a lot of environmental. I used to work with Dr. Ray of American Environmental Health. He was the foremost authority on environmental illness, multiple chemical sensitivities. And what part of the problem is you have unknown or unrealized sources of toxicity that accumulate in your body. And over a period of years, these toxic substances, they bioaccumulate and they affect different organ systems, including the brain. So you have to first realize that what are some of the causes of your problem? Of course, you need treatment, but you have to detoxify out all those toxins. That's a tricky business because you got to be careful with detoxing. And the point is you don't want to reload your body with more toxins. So you're trying to get well, you're detoxifying, but if you drink or ingest more toxins, you're not gaining anything. So you really can't recover your health or make progress if you keep reloading your body. And that's where water is a big source of toxins in your body. Yes, I have seen referrals where people, one of the big things today, just to get off a little bit on the subject, is PFAS chemicals. There are clusters of cancer around the United States. I have some in Massachusetts. Long Island, where I lived for many years, has a lot of, I call them disease clusters. But those are areas that have more toxins in the water. So I've definitely related the levels of toxins, the types of toxins, the various cancers, which is where I started looking into this in the 1980s. We were seeing, I had two patients, one with brain cancer and one with liver cancer. And the North Shore University Hospital System became very concerned because they were seeing an increase in these rare cancers. So I became a member of a task force to look into environmental factors, which we found from all the dumping from industry over the years and was getting back up in the water. So in the 1980s, 1990s, there wasn't a lot of published data on this clinical data, but more now than ever before, they're relating toxic substances, whether it's aluminum, arsenic, mercury. Lead is a ubiquitous heavy metal, definitely a neurotoxin that's been around and recognized over thousands of years. It was part of the reason the Roman Empire fell because of sterility, and it's a cardiotoxin, neurotoxin. It's in every water system in the United States. And when you're drinking water with lead in it, which is 99% of the time, this is going to affect your brain. That's one of the many issues. Plus, they're adding aluminum sulfate to clarify the water because a lot of water comes out of the reservoirs or lakes, rivers, and streams. Their source water, it's cloudy. It has turbidity. So they add aluminum sulfate as a chelating agent to clarify the water. Well, of course, we all know aluminum is a neurotoxin.
Well, let's be clear though. So at the very last step of the water purification, they add the aluminum to get rid of the particulates. But to be clear, they don't get rid of the aluminum before they put it in the tap water, right?
That's correct. Absolutely. So there's substances they want to get rid of. Most of the time, they're adding more toxins than they're getting rid of. The main function of a municipal treatment company is to make the water potable. And potable means it's free of disease-causing microbes, particularly bacteria like E. coli. And they monitor the water for what they call indicator organisms, coliforms, and they add chlorine and or chloramine, which is chlorine plus ammonia. And these chemicals get into the water stream in your city, gets to your sink, and you're drinking a lot of the residual contaminants, the chemicals, the byproducts, which are called trihalomethanes. All these chemicals are in your drinking water, plus whatever they add. One of the worst neurotoxins is fluoride. We're talking about chemical fluoride. That's fluorosilicic acid. So chemical fluoride now has been studied extensively. It's definitely a neurotoxin, and there's over 20 studies sponsored by the NIH, which have shown that women who drink fluoridated water within the allowable concentrations have children with lower IQs. That's astounding. I mean, it's really dangerous. So there's now a movement. It's been going on for years, but Florida, where I live, the Surgeon General now has banned it in the water. It cannot be added. I believe Utah, they signed the bill, the governor, to ban chemical fluoride. I think eventually the EPA will say, no, we don't want to add it because the risk of neurological disease, damage to your thyroid, it's a carcinogen, so it has pervasive negative health effects on your body versus whatever alleged benefits. And unfortunately, people don't realize that as you get older, fluoride displaces calcium in your bones and actually aggravates osteoporosis. So that's a toxin that's been around for years. It's been a byproduct of the aluminum industry. There's a whole industry that supplies it to the water treatment companies. And in some cases, they had a lot of it over what's allowed. If you go back 20, 30 years, they allowed, the EPA, it's still on the books, 4 parts per million, which is way too toxic. Then they lowered it to 2 parts. What they were finding is that if you had too much fluoride, children in particular get brown staining teeth. It's called mottling, which is a sign of toxicity. Now, as you get older, the fluoride is going to damage your organ systems, and you really don't need it because if you have good dental hygiene, you could avoid cavities. And if you want to use fluoride topically, sodium fluoride, you can use that, but systemically, you're ingesting on a daily basis a neurotoxic substance. And they're starting to get indications that this is contributory to dementia.
Which is really scary. So, we're talking here right now about drinking water, and I remember growing up, my parents said, "Oh, you don't have to worry about it. Basically, all water is safe. Like, why would you ever pay for extra purification? Why would you ever pay if you go out to a restaurant? Why would you pay for bottled water? Tap water is fine." So, and so again, that's what I was brought up with. And then I know my parents, they learned that from their parents. So let me ask you this. Was there ever a time in this country where it was safe to drink the tap water?
Well, interesting question. If you go back into our revolutionary times, 1700s, 1800s, the biggest issues were microbes, pathogens in the water supply. Because basically, animals poop in the water. There was no treatment, and people were getting sick over the years, and they realized something is not right. So a lot of the taverns opened up, and people would buy beer because they cooked the water to make beer. So that was a secondary benefit, that they weren't drinking pathogens. So yeah, there was a time, I'd say, there weren't as many toxins in the water. And when I started looking into this back in the 1970s, you usually see chlorine, a few heavy metals, maybe a few industrial chemicals. But today is a wider array of toxic substances. So when I look at a water report, it's like a blood test. And they list, in most of the big cities anyway, all the chemicals. So we're seeing commonly, of course, chlorine and chloramine. We're seeing these new PFAS chemicals, forever chemicals that come from Teflon, firefighting foam. And when you see...
And clothes, too. There are the stain-free clothes. And if you're wearing that all day, unfortunately, you're also going to absorb some of these PFAS.
Absolutely. They just settled 2 big lawsuits with DuPont and Chemours for tens of billions of dollars. And, the data, this clinical data is showing that there's a definite correlation with areas that have higher levels of PFAS in certain types of cancer, like bladder cancer, colon cancer. I'm not sure how it affects the brain, but it affects your immune system. And it's another
it's also a neurotoxin. It's an endocrine disruptor, but it also hurts the brain. And what's scary to me is when I run levels for my patients with Alzheimer's and other brain problems, sometimes their levels of PFAS are very high. And if we get those out of them, their symptoms get better. So from that perspective,
That's
I,
where water treatment, water
yeah.
filtration comes in. And they're very difficult to remove. They're called the forever chemicals. I've been monitoring this for a while. I connect into the water engineers, water industry, companies that make resin. So now we're adding a PFAS removing resin to our filtration tanks and also our filters because carbons will help. They do get it out. That's what the EPA recommends. But now you have to add these new filter resins to get the rest of these PFAS, which are difficult. So you don't want to be ingesting those every day. And when you talk about levels of toxicity, chlorine is toxic at parts per million. The byproducts of chlorine are toxic at parts per billion. These substances are toxic at parts per trillion. So the new standard, the maximum standard they allow is 10 parts per trillion, but they want to lower it to 4. But you really don't want to be drinking, you want to drink 0. And that's difficult. So the part of the problem that we have to discuss in a little bit is how to remove all these toxic substances from our drinking and bathing water, because if you don't, you're reloading your body, you're adding all these new substances which are even more toxic.
So let's be clear. I mean, obviously, if I drink water and there's something toxic in the water, that's going to get into me. But it's the same process if I take a bath or a shower. If there's water brushing up against my skin and there are toxins in there, some of those toxins can get absorbed through the skin.
Well,
is that right?
primarily the chemicals. Heavy metals really don't absorb through the skin. You have to ingest them. However, every municipality, like I said, is chlorine or chloramine, and the byproducts are trihalomethanes. Those are a whole group of chemical byproducts that form in the main pipes. 30% of those chemicals that are in your water are absorbed during a shower. You breathe them in as a gas, you absorb them through your skin, and you're ingesting them. Or certain industrial chemicals will also become a gas at 100 degrees. You can absorb some of those chemicals, some of the PFAS chemicals, yes. So showering is part of the absorption process where you're exposed to these toxic chemicals. On the other side of it, you're cooking water, you're rinsing your vegetables. Now, I'll give you an example. Arsenic, which is a very toxic heavy metal, fairly common in water systems. Another substance you don't want to be ingesting, it accumulates in your body along with lead and other heavy metals. You rinse your vegetables, where it sticks to your fruits and vegetables when you rinse your vegetables. So you have to eliminate that for the whole house. All these heavy metals, mostly arsenic, uranium, I see, aluminum, lead, mercury, cadmium, nickel. Those are fairly common substances, heavy metals that we see in municipal water. Why? Because there's been industrial dumping, there's toxic waste sites. The pipes sometimes are made out of lead. You go into New York City and the late 1800s and some other cities, they use lead pipes. They're still there. They're leaching lead into the water. Some levels are very high. Now, the worst example, that was Flint, Michigan, which you may have heard of. There was a big crisis there several years ago.
Well, and just to be clear, it was the worst in terms of public relations, but I would argue there are other places in this country with water just as toxic as Flint.
Oh, yeah. Well, the problem is you have old infrastructure. The infrastructure built didn't address most of the main pipes that are rotting and decayed, made out of lead, some cases asbestos and other substances that are toxic. So all these pipes are in the ground. You have hundreds of thousands, millions of miles of them, and they haven't addressed. The only time they fix it is when there's a leak and it leaches bacteria into the water and they have a boil alert. Then they really dose up the chlorine. So there's two parts of the problem. There's the toxic waste sites that are dumping into the ground. All these toxins are coming back up into the drinking water. Agricultural dumping. People dump their pharmaceuticals into water. We see pharmaceuticals now, lithium in some cases, psychoactive drugs. They've been identified low levels, but those are other substances that have neurotoxic effects. So you have pharmaceuticals, heavy metals, certain chemicals, like I said, endocrine disruptors, plastics, phthalates. Then you have the microplastics, of course. And you asked me earlier about bottled water. Well, people go out and buy a lot of bottled water. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and studies have shown that 60% of the bottled water has more contaminants than the filtered water. And you're buying expensive water, and it's not solving your problem because you still have to bathe in water, drink, cook with it, rinse your vegetables. So you have a partial solution that's expensive that may still be toxic.
Right. And just to be clear, because a lot of people think, oh, this bottle says spring water, that means it's safe. My experience is exact opposite. If it comes from a spring, it's probably a contaminated spring. What are your thoughts?
Perfect example. Years ago, Poland Springs, everybody thought it was from a spring in Maine, but they had multiple sources. And the National Resource Defense Council tested over 100 bottled waters, including spring water, and they found different sources had different toxins. So you may have 2 or 3 chemicals, a couple of heavy metals, a little radioactivity, and you're not getting a solution by just drinking bottled water. You can't just you can't bathe in it. You can't buy enough to rinse it. It's impractical. So the only solution is really to clean your water in your home with proper filtration. So that's the real crux of the problem. You have to do something to get rid of the toxic substances for all uses, consumption, bathing, everything you use water for, because it's critical. You want to clean it up and not have any more exposure to any toxic substances.
Perfect. And I've also heard people say, "Hey, I've got well water. It's well water, therefore it's safe." Have you seen contaminated well water?
Well, I probably have looked at a few hundred reports, not as many as city water, but typically the common toxins we find is iron, manganese, which is a little toxic. Some cases we see arsenic and uranium. Now, the good side is you don't have to chlorinate the water. If there's bacteria, we can use ultraviolet to kill bacteria. So you don't have that chemical additive. You're not adding aluminum sulfate. So it's easier to clean up most wells. I've seen a few really clean ones, not many. Unfortunately, some wells are in areas that have commercial operations around them, and they're impacted by waste dumps, other sources of contaminants that get into the hydrogeology that can impact your well. So that's why we test wells, and we always ask if it's on a previously farmed area. There could be nitrates, pesticides. Those are hormone disruptors and toxins. So I say yes, in general, well water is better than most city water, but you still have to test it to find out what's in it to remove it. So you have to look at it carefully.
Got it. And then one time sometimes I get pushback when someone says, but I don't want to drink filtered water, because not only are you taking out all these bad forever chemicals, heavy metals, you're taking out the minerals that are just so important. What can people do if they're worried about their minerals?
Okay, well, if you look at a water report, I'll give you an example. Houston, which has radioactivity, pesticides, PFAS chemicals, a lot of heavy metals, uranium. I wouldn't use that as my source of calcium. I mean, 90% of your calcium comes from food. I mean, if you use green vegetables, I'm not a big dairy user, but, you can get calcium from a lot of sources. So to answer your question, the first step is if you're filtering your water, when you identify the contaminants, you have to select filter materials and technology to remove it. In some cases, there's red flags. For example, uranium, radioactivity, chromium-6, those are all carcinogens, chlorate. They require a reverse osmosis membrane to be effective to remove it. So when I have to use reverse osmosis membranes, we're using a lot of pre-filtration with different filter materials, but ultimately the membrane will remove certain substances. It's the best way to do it. So the downside is you're removing about 80% of the minerals because the membrane doesn't discriminate between heavy metals and normal minerals. Now, you can remineralize the water with a post-alkaline or remineralizer cartridge. It's not always necessary. It depends on the pH of the water after it's filtered. That's one option. Or you can add, there's different mineral substances. You could put a couple of drops in the water if you want. But technically, my goal is to reduce the contaminants as close to non-detect as possible. And to accomplish that, you have to use RO membranes in some cases. So yes, you lose some of the minerals, but you're gaining clean water, which is much more important than losing 5% of your mineral intake or source.
I agree with you 100%. Can you explain something to me? One thing that I learned from you is that even if two people, let's say their houses are a mile away from each other, they may be dealing with very different contaminants in their water. Why would that be? Yeah, why would is that true, and why would that be?
Well, it's partly true. Generally, depending on the main pipe, some sections, you could have a street, a house that has a section of pipe coming in from 100 years ago, and they started replacing the pipe. So you might see more sediment, more iron, discoloration. Those are things that sometimes we see in certain cities. Down here in Florida, I see it in Fort Lauderdale. I see iron in certain sections. It's around. The other side of it is if they blend the water, you might be in a certain district or section of that overall water supply system, and they blend the water. You might be getting your source water from a different well, which could have a little more contaminants. So we see that often where you have 3 or 4 different regions within a city, and there are some differences.
Got it. And what I like about what you do is that specifically you do testing first, and then based on those test results, you can design a solution for removing the problems. Is that true?
Well, the first thing is if you're on municipal water, they're doing the testing. That's required by the EPA. Minimally 119 contaminants. These are regulated contaminants. Then you have unregulated. So typically when I look at a water report, if it's pretty thorough and I see everything I need to see, I use that as the basis for designing a system. In some cases in city water, we want to go a little further because certain contaminants are not tested for, PFAS, for example. So I have the client call the city up. If they're not reporting unregulated, have they tested for it and get some values like hardness, sometimes iron or PFAS. So that's required because it's a FOIA request, and typically they'll give you that information, then they'll send it to me. I do test wells pretty extensively because I want to know what's in there, and you don't have a municipal report. So 99% of the time, unless the client has a well report already, I'm going to test it. There are a couple of companies that test the water pretty thoroughly. I use National Testing Labs as one of the companies, but once I get the report, I also want to know a little more information about their home, about the well, how big it is, the pump, how many people live in the house, anybody has any specific health concerns or health issues, because they may be sensitive to certain things. So that all our equipment is tested and listed by NSF. We don't have any leachable substances because I've been dealing with chemically sensitive individuals for years. And all equipment is tested and listed, certified, and documented for making the claims that we make. And I have to do that because I'm dealing with a lot of people with very serious health issues. So I'm not going to put anything in our equipment that's going to leach into their filtered water. I mean, that's an absolute definite requirement. So yes, we do test, and I look at reports. We look at the equipment certifications. The new material I use, the PFAS, was tested and certified. I started using it several months ago. The companies I deal with are reliable and they have all testing and certification. So there's 2 parts to it. 1, what's in your water? You get a complete understanding of it. 2, it's like a blood test. You look at it and then you have to design a treatment. So that's what we do. And there's so many companies out there, and people really are wasting their money when they go on the internet and buy an off-the-shelf system. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but they're popular out there. One begins with Aqua, ends with Sauna. These are small systems. They don't backwash. They're little, I call them bottle filters. They're inadequate, and they're just wasting money. I've ripped out a lot of those and replaced them. And I'm dealing with, doctors themselves, nutritionalists, different clinics, health professionals, affiliates. And, they're asking me to test the water after I filter it. So I have case studies where we go into a city, I put a system in, we'll test the water after the tanks and after the RO unit, and it's clean. I mean, it could have
and RO is reverse osmosis, right?
osmosis, right? That's one of the types of I have many different types of filters. Another thing which a lot of people don't understand or recognize are parasites. Parasites are a huge problem. They're in all surface water, lakes, rivers, streams, reservoirs. So if it's in the EPA water reports, they'll tell you if you have an immune deficiency, you're on chemotherapy, you have to filter the water to 1 micron or less, smaller. So we have ceramic filters or the membranes. because if you ingest the parasites like Russian roulette, they're in the water. It's not in every drop of water. It's not every gallon, but over time, you're going to ingest a cryptosporidium or a giardia. That could be lethal, especially if you have an immune deficiency. I was just watching medical show. They found a parasite in someone's brain. They had to remove it. It was a big worm-like parasite. It was from pork. But yeah, they're in the water and they can get into your brain. So you have to filter the water down to a certain micron level, which we do.
And let's just be clear: we're talking about the United States. Not, I mean, you can find parasites everywhere, but
yeah,
we're not talking about someone traveling to a third world country. We're talking about the United States,
yeah.
and we're talking about tap water, either from the sink in your kitchen or if from your shower. That if you're not filtering and there happen to be parasites in the local supply, that could affect you personally.
Oh, in the shower, you have to open your mouth and get the water in your mouth, but drinking it, yes. So on the water reports for cities or towns over 50,000 people, they have to test for parasites. And they may find what they call oocysts, which are little balls. And if you ingest one, it opens up in your digestive tract. These little worms come out. They're nasty little buggers. So when I was in microbiology, I was working for the Department of Health. You saw people come back from Mexico and they get these travelers. These are big parasites. They're gigantic. We're not talking about that. But commonly in water, surface water in particular, there's animal waste. They poop in the water. You can have Cryptosporidium and giardia, fairly common. So you want to filter your water thoroughly down to 1 micron or less. That's one of the parts of the systems at the sink that we incorporate into our filter units. You don't want to ingest parasites. That can be real harmful.
Along those lines, also, what's called biofilm. I mean, parasites can be part of biofilm, but there are other bacteria. There's Legionnaires, etc. How important is you mentioned hundreds of years ago, you had to worry about bugs in your water. How much of an issue is that today?
Not common as far as E. coli. That's one of the biggies. Now, when you have a system, and there are some really bad water systems in the United States. I'm not going to pick on Jackson, Mississippi, but they have a real antiquated system. They don't have the money to fix it, and they're always getting violations. Typically, E. coli happens in certain circumstances after a hurricane or flooding conditions. I'm working with the people down in Kerrville, Texas now, with the flooding down there, and that's a disaster. But you don't see that often, but they will have microbes in there. It could be pathogens. So they have to filter the water. I've sent down gravity units, emergency filters with ceramics. When you get a boil alert, if you get a notice, it's usually late, day or two later, that somebody was digging the pavement, they're putting in new homes, or somebody put in the gas line, they breached the sewer or the water lines. They issue a boil alert because there's bacteria now. They have to dose up the chlorine levels or chlorine much higher. And that goes on for a couple of days. If you get a boil alert, you have E. coli or something, potentially a pathogen. Not always, but usually. But it's not typical. But we do see coliform bacteria a lot in wells, depending on how good the cover is of the well. When you get flooding, you may get surface water breaching into the well. That could be a parasite leaching down into the well. That's why we put ultraviolet units at the point of entry in homes that can kill parasites as a precaution, because you're not chlorinating the well. So we want to make sure it's always potable. But typically, parasites are common more than E. coli.
Got it. So if you're trying to be protected, it sounds like one of the best solutions might be a whole house solution where all the water's getting filtered or purified. Is that right?
To filter out all the contaminants, you have to have 2 parts to a system. Unless you live in an apartment, which you can't use a point of entry. So point of entry filters are large tanks, like a big oxygen tank, and they're loaded with several types of carbon. We use different filter materials for arsenic, uranium when they're present, radioactivity if it's present. So we put special filter materials in the tank. So every drop of water that comes in your house is virtually chemical free. You have reduced heavy metals, and you finish up the filtration process at the sink. And that's where we're going to use, either multi-stage filters or possibly several filters with an RO membrane, depending, again, what contaminants you want to remove. Yes, a whole house system would be the best solution. I mean, now you eliminate all the exposure in your showers and baths, and you're reducing the chemical load, so your sink filters will work better, and you're actually going to get 99+% clean water for consumption and cooking and all your rinsing your vegetables.
Awesome. And so there are a ton of different technologies between activated carbon, reverse osmosis, ion exchange, distillation. How do you put together a plan for someone after you look at their water report?
Well, the first thing we do an intake. I'm a doctor, and I want to get information about their house, what their concerns are, if they see any staining, smells, things like that. So that gives me a lot of information first. So if someone contacts us, we'll have an information sheet to fill out. Then we'll look up the water report. Then we have a consultation. And I'll go over the water report and recommend a filtration equipment solution to clean the water within their capabilities, budget-wise or infrastructure-wise, whether an apartment, you can do less in an apartment, but you can effectively remove most of the chemicals, some of the heavy metals. But in the home, you really need a full-use solution, and that's when we'll recommend certain equipment. And it's all customized to remove those contaminants detected. So that's the best way to clean the water, totally. And then you don't really have to worry about ingesting and taking a cup of water out of the sink, out of the filtered water. You're safe. Then you have healthy, clean water, not allowable concentration water. Big difference.
Agreed. Is it okay if I ask you a bunch of questions, rapid fire? Um, awesome. So if I choose to drink coffee or tea, do I need to use filtered water?
Absolutely. I have an RO unit in my office here, and that's all I use for my tea and beverages. So I'm drinking RO water right now.
Got it. And if you had a choice between drinking the tap water where you live or bottled water, which is the lesser evil?
Well, it depends on the bottled water. The only bottled water that I found, there's two of them out there. One is Mountain Valley. If you get in glass bottles, it's very expensive. It's like $2-3 a liter. Or they come in 5-gallon containers, which you have to use a machine to dispense it. There's a couple other ones out there. Yes, if I had no other choice, I would drink Mountain Valley water versus drinking where I live, Martin County water, which has chemicals, uranium, and arsenic.
Wow. Okay. So what would you say is the most dangerous toxin in U.S. tap water if you could only choose one?
Good question. That's a tough one. I would say PFAS would be number one on my list, and probably arsenic and uranium.
Okay. Wow. And then uranium, is that because it's often radioactive, or is there a different reason?
Well, uranium is a naturally occurring element, but it does decay into radioactive particles, including alpha and beta particles, radium, and radon. Radon, if you're in a radon area, you have to ventilate your house. You'll get lung cancer, But in the water, uranium itself is a heavy metal. It's neurotoxic also. And the radioactivity will cause cancer because it damages the DNA inside your cells. So you have a two-parts problem there. You have the metal itself and the radioactive decay products. So that requires a little more filtration. And if you have a high amount of uranium and radon, which you should test your house, most people know they're in a radon zone. So when you buy a house, it's disclosed, or they already put a ventilation system in. But now in the water, you still have the same radioactive components, which requires a little bit more technology to remove it.
Okay, so let's say someone worked with you, their house is covered, but they like going camping. What do you recommend when someone, or when you, if you ever go travel, if you go camping, what would you take with you? Because of course you're not necessarily going to have as pure the water at your house, but what can you do if you
Well,
camp?
you travel around, we use ceramic gravity filters. And when you're overseas, particularly when you go to Mexico, and I saw all these problems coming back from people who visited certain countries. Now, there are parasites in the water or microbes that are pathogens. Generally, if you take a travel filter with ceramics, that'll cover most of it. Then you need a handheld ultraviolet. So you filter the water through the ceramic. That takes care of the parasites, most of the bacteria. Then you have a glass that you dip this UV sterilizer in for a minute, and you're covered. Kills the viruses. People travel all over the world. I had a lot of clients in my practice. They went to these hot zones, and they came back. When I was in the military, I saw people, soldiers coming back from Vietnam. They had a lot of really exotic diseases that they picked up being from the water, mostly. So traveling, yes, a gravity emergency travel filter. We have those.
Awesome. And because I've heard that even rainwater now has glyphosate and other toxins in it. So the old adage, oh, just collect rainwater, you'll be safe. Not necessarily anymore. Is that true?
Well, it's a common practice in the Caribbean. It's called rainwater off the roof, and they have collection barrels. Then you have to filter it for sediment and ultraviolet. When Fukushima blew off, well, the radioactive particles traveled over to the United States, hit the West Coast. So they found cesium, strontium, and it got into the milk supply. Yeah, there's some radioactivity that comes from atmospheric discharge. Most of the nuclear power plants discharge gas, which is radioactive. It gets into the water supply and in the air. So, yeah, there's a lot of contaminants in the air that are discharged from factories. Classic is up in New England, the maple syrup trees all died from the acid rain, from the coal plants discharging sulfur. So become hydrogen sulfide or sulfuric acid. So there's pollutants in the air that get it to the water supply, surface water.
Wow. And we often see marketed alkaline water. Is that science or is it marketing hype? What do you think of this alkaline water products?
Well, I've seen a lot of these multi-level companies over the years. It's a cottage industry. One of them, Kangen Water, there's a bunch of others. It was actually the patent, I believe, is held by Matsushita. So the clinical studies in Japan show that alkalization of your gut helps reduce bacteria growth, because when you have an acidic condition, eating carbohydrates, sugar, and other garbage, your body becomes acidic, which is where bacteria thrive in the gut. So the machines that create this alkaline water, it's really ionized water, they're splitting water in half, creating an H plus particle and an OH negative free radical. So it's not really pure alkalizing the body with minerals. And 12 doctors that I dealt with over the years, nutritionists and everyone else, they found that, yes, you're hydrating more so people feel better. They have all this anecdotal evidence. I looked at all the clinical studies. They never proved that it does one bit to improve your health. It's an expensive machine. And actually, I think it's harmful, in my opinion, that it's creating an OH free radical. So I don't recommend them.
Got it. Another product I see out there is structured water. What do you think about structured water?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of devices now. We had talked about hydrogen water. I'm looking into it. I think there's some positive clinical data on hydrogen water. The other stuff, the structured water, these magic balls, supposedly the water cascades over it. There's a whole bunch of these devices out there. You can spend $1,000, $2,000 or more dollars on a device that, to me, doesn't have any benefit. I'd rather you put the money into cleaning your water up. Then if you want to waste your money spending on these devices, do it after you clean the water. The other doctor that I like is Dr. Pollitt, which is the fourth state of water. I met him. I think he's onto something. I haven't followed him recently, but they seem to have some clinical data that shows it improves your health. But again, my focus more is on cleaning the water up first.
That's great. What about these smart water monitors? Is that a gimmick or a game changer?
I think, you have to look at what you're monitoring. What are you monitoring? You could test your pH of your water with test strips. You could use color dyes. There's ways of testing your alkalinity simply. Those are things that I think are more related to health, where, you want to get some minerals in your water. So, for example, if you're using a reverse osmosis, your TDS monitor, so you're monitoring the membrane. So TDS, total dissolved solids, is mostly minerals. So now we use an RO membrane, and if the TDS drops to 20, then gradually it starts going up. It indicates that the membrane is starting to crack. So you want to change the membrane. But TDS by itself is not harmful. People think, if you have more TDS, it's not good. But in some cases, the adding minerals, the TDS goes up. I'm not sure about smart monitors. You're talking about the electric devices. Yeah, I don't like anything that's electrical for EMF reasons. Anything that they claim will reduce the alkalinity or hardness with a coil, you have to use a softener or descale the material. The other devices really aren't effective.
Wow. So if we could talk a little bit more about these forever chemicals, the PFAS, because they're called forever because of this carbon fluoride bond. Is that true?
Correct. The what I'm seeing more emerge. These are called emerging contaminants. They've been emerging for years, but there's been more focus on it now because more data showing it's very harmful at very extremely low levels. They had to create the EPA had to create new MCLs or maximum concentration levels going back several years, started at 70 parts per trillion they allowed. Then they dropped it to 10, which is the current MCL. Now they want to get it down to 4, but there's pushback from the municipal treatment companies to try to get that level down. They have to spend a lot of money, which they don't have. So again, it's incumbent upon the consumer to finish up the filtration process. Unfortunately, we rely on municipal treatment companies to give us clean water, but they're not. All they do is meet the standards in most cases, but the standards are not adequate. I published a paper on that called The Myth of Clean Water, and that's the big issue today. If you call a municipal treatment company and you ask them, is my water safe, they'll say it meets the standards. That doesn't mean it's safe or healthy. The Environmental Working Group has studied this extensively, and they've shown that much lower levels of contaminants are much more harmful than what's allowed. So that's really the key right there. So you could be within the MCL for certain contaminants, like arsenic. I'll give you a quick example. 30, 40 years ago, they allowed 50 parts per billion. That's back in the 1980s and 90s. Then they studied it more, way too high. They dropped it to 10 parts. Now they're saying, well, we really want to get it to 0, but the municipal treatment companies can't afford to do that. So what do? You have to filter your water. That's it. So it's a moving scenario. Science changes, new information comes out, but I see more of these PFAS, and they're tough to get out. My studies on our materials get out 95 to 98%, but sometimes you have to use more than one filtration tank. So when I see high toxicity, like in Massachusetts, on the East Coast here, and I lecture at Hippocrates, you lecture there, and people have come in there. I've related those high levels of PFAS to certain types of cancer. I've seen it anecdotally. So yes, they're a real problem, and they have to be addressed. That's one of the top red flag contaminants that I deal with. So
Got it.
that requires a little more filtration equipment.
But it's important because I see it as one of the keys in many cases of Alzheimer's and other brain problems. Let me ask you, how long have you been in this water business, analyzing the water for, roughly?
Well, I really started, I worked for a pharmaceutical company, so I made a 360-degree turn. I had an injury, spinal injury. I was partially paralyzed, became a chiropractor as a result. So practicing on Long Island in the 1980s, we were seeing these cancers I mentioned earlier. The hospital system was concerned. So we started looking into sources of these cancers. That's when I got into the water problem. So we saw a lot of chemicals in the water. Nobody was addressing it. So that's when I first became aware. I'm going back 1980s now. So I was looking for solutions to clean my own water, and then I started looking for my patients. So that's when I kind of evolved into the environmental health field. And by 2005, I've been in practice 30 years. The environmental business grew, and I became affiliated with a lot of doctors that were concerned, and it just mushroomed. So my focus now has been on water contamination and air. We want to have a healthy indoor environment. That's the key. So you want to use toxic chemicals in your house. I work with a company called Speiser. I'll plug them because they're a great company. They have all non-toxic cleaning agents. You don't want to use any toxic substances, organic food, juicing, as you know, for your detoxing and nutrients, and clean water and air. So we do air purification also because studies have shown these microparticles get into your brain. They're also neurotoxic in the air, especially if you live near a busy traffic area.
Yeah, it's scary. So you've been looking at these reports for, it sounds like, at least 30 years.
35 years, right.
35 years. Is your sense that the toxin levels have been going up, down, or stay the same? Or is it hard to tell because is it different? Are you measuring different things now than you were 35 years ago? But what is your sense? Is the water quality in general getting better, worse, or about the same?
Horribly worse. Horribly worse. And again, I mentioned earlier, when I first started looking at water, I've seen chlorine, few heavy metals, possibly some industrial chemicals. Over the years, these emerging contaminants have expanded. So now I might see 20, 30, 40 contaminants in some water systems at low levels and sometimes high levels. And it's definitely growing because whatever was dumped in the backyard by industries 30, 40 years ago has migrated down into the aquifers. And if you have underground wells as your source water, it's all coming back up in your drinking water. So absolutely many more contaminants. These PFAS weren't even considered 5 years ago, 10 years ago. They've been dumping them since the 1950s. From Air Force bases, military bases, they spread out in the hydrogeology, and they're coming back up in people's drinking water, especially in a certain radius of industrial waste zones or toxic sites. So I lived on Long Island. We had identified over 200 toxic waste sites, and Long Island, where I used to live, has some of the worst water in the country. There's other areas. Houston is worse, Dallas, but Houston is another area. What I see in Texas is kind of weird because I see cyanide a lot. Why is it peculiar to Texas? Because you have refineries, other industries, the petrochemical industry. So I see other toxic substances you don't typically find in most other drinking water. So yes, there's a trend. It's getting worse, and it's getting more complicated to remove these contaminants. So I started out with one little filter, then I had multiple filters. Now I'm doing tanks, ROs, sometimes 2 tanks or 3 tanks. I have pictures on my website where we had to put 4 tanks in. There's high arsenic, high PFAS. You need 2 tanks for high PFAS in some cases. So yeah, it's getting more complicated and definitely more contaminated.
Right. And that's why I wanted to have you on, is because I'm seeing in my patients, I've been doing this long enough that I'm starting to see a trend of more and more higher and higher levels of all these different toxins. And it makes sense because they're still making forever chemicals and these other toxins and chemical plants. And they're also injecting this, for example, fracking, even though the specific chemicals they're using may be proprietary and we don't know the specifics, that it could be that cyanide or some of these other things are being injected into the land in order to extract petroleum.
Well, you brought up a good point. Fracking is not regulated seriously enough, and they use toxic chemicals to break up the soil and the rock to extract the water. Now they're going deeper into some of these aquifers, and over time that's going to migrate out and rise up into the superficial aquifers. So long term, I think we have a huge problem, not only in the amount of water that's available, because the western part of the United States has droughts. You look at the Colorado River, which supplies most of the western states, it's dropped down to drastically low levels. And the only other options we have is desalination. When I was down in the Caribbean, they had Aruba, for example. They have desalination plants, but now you're breathing in all the petrochemical smells, but you get water. So I think they have to look at other options other than just drilling down in the ground, because I think every source of water that I see has some contaminants, and some areas that have a lot of contaminants. And they're definitely increasing more in urban areas or areas that have a lot of commercial activity. Old toxic waste sites that have been there for years, just leaching contaminants into the ground. Those substances are getting at higher levels. So when I monitor the water over a period of years, I'll go back 4 years because I have clients that we have to replace the filter material in their tanks. Now I see new contaminants or higher levels of the previous contaminants that were detected. So yeah, there's definitely a trend that's worse.
Right. So again, going back to my parents or my grandparents, it could be that we're focusing on this, and we need to focus on this now because the levels are so much higher of many of these toxins than they were many decades ago.
Well, if you go back to Europe, my family came from Europe, and they didn't have a lot of these diseases. They were in a whole different environment. or putting additives in the food, fertilizing the crops with all kinds of toxic chemicals. It's a whole different lifestyle. So they probably die more from injuries or infections than from cancer or heart disease. So yes, the whole profile of disease has changed, and all the dementia and Alzheimer's now cumulative. It's getting worse because, again, we're exposed to much more toxic substances in every aspect of our life. We live in a toxic world. One of my friends wrote a book on that, how to stay healthy in a toxic world. So, yes, it's a challenge, and I think I have part of the answer, which is one of the components of health and disease. And I think people need to focus on a lot of different contaminant sources, but water is a crucial part, that they need clean water.
I agree with you 100%. So that was the bad news. Are you optimistic about anything in this field? Do you go to conferences, or is there a new technology that you see may be adopted in the next 6 months?
Well, the water industry is certainly aware of these newer contaminants. So they develop different resins, they're all working on different technologies to eliminate the PFAS chemicals. I think the University of Montreal was working on something. It was a interesting, intriguing technology. So they're going to need to do this because standard filter materials are absorbing these contaminants. Now, what do you do with the material after you're finished with it? It's full of toxins. You have to dispose of it. So now you got a toxic waste problem. Same thing in the nuclear industry. You have all this nuclear waste. Where do you put it? So yes, they have to focus on this. I think there's good science out there now. Of course, there's monetary motivation to develop products that will remove these substances. I think all the other contaminants, they have a lot of material out that it's very effective, but how do you put it together? So you need a water specialist. That's one of my hats that I spent 5 years studying water with the Water Quality Association, but there's always new things I'm learning. And if something comes up and I'm not familiar with it, I'll call water engineers that I deal with. Some of these companies are very good experts. So if I have to put a new system in, something I have to use new material, I have to educate myself and use their resources. And I read all this information. So before I incorporate new material, I need to know what it does, how to use it, how to integrate it with my other filter materials. So all my filters now that I make in my manufacturing plant have PFAS removing resins. They're all rated. We tested them. They're listed with NSF. So there's new standards for that. So yes, it's evolving all the time. I'm optimistic that we can have technology remove it, but I think it requires a lot more education of the public, because I'm in a market niche where I have clients that are very health conscious, mostly a lot of young mothers, thank goodness, because they're very concerned about raising their children with either outdoor toxicity or indoor toxicity. So they're looking for these type of products, or people are very sick and they need to clean, they're advised by health professionals that they need to do other things other than just a treatment. There's ancillary things you need to do. So how we can do is, it's difficult because of the lifestyle change.
Of course. So how can people reach you or find you online or in social media?
Well, my company name is Clean Water Revival Inc. Clean Water Revival Inc. Our website is CWRENVIRO.com. So it's CWRENVIRO.com. If they want to contact us, what I usually recommend when people refer to us, go to the website. There's a questionnaire at the bottom. Fill it out or call us directly. It's 800-444-3563. And just ask for my associate, Dr. Romeo. She'll do an intake and we can have a contact with you and a consult. So it's 800-444-3563, extension 1. Be happy to advise them, review their water reports and give them advice on how to clean up their water.
That's awesome. And they'll also give them a discount with the code Dr. Josh.
You'll be happy to do that.
Yeah. DRGOSH, Dr. Josh. Awesome. Is there any question I should have asked you but didn't?
Yes. A lot of people that contact us are very confused about information they read on the internet. There's 1,000+ water purveyors out in the marketplace. Some of them are good, some of them are not good. And a lot of people waste a lot of money and time, and they're not getting the equipment, filtration equipment solution they need. So that's what I try to do first. I try to be very specific and educate people. I have a lot of articles on my blog. I publish a lot of articles, but if you go to my website, there's a blog, you can read a lot. But I think directing people's attention to what specifically they need, rather than just buying an off-the-shelf system, going to Home Depot or buying an off-the-shelf system, is not the solution. They can spend a lot of money and waste their money. They get a little bit of filtration, some of the chemicals, but not all these other toxic substances. So they need to really get the right information, be educated a little bit, and directed to what's the best solution for them. That's what I do.
Wow. Dr. Roy, this has been eye-opening. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. And frankly, thanks for being in this field for decades to counteract this huge hazard that I know my patients are facing with Alzheimer's and other chronic brain diseases, but it's not just the brain, it's cancer and so many other chronic conditions. So I salute you. Thank you so much for your expertise and helping people out in the field.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your podcast, and I appreciate all your work. And hopefully, I think there's a very good synergy here. So hopefully your clients, patients will take advantage of my information, and we'd be happy to help them as best we can.
Awesome. Peace and plants.